March 17th, 1944, 24,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler tightened his grip on the control stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, watching the contrails of 32 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses etch white lines across the frozen sky. He had shot down 28 Allied aircraft. He was 27 years old, a veteran of campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and now the defense of the Reich itself. The massive American bombers flew in their characteristic combat box formation, each aircraft positioned to provide overlapping fields of defensive fire. Stigler knew these tactics intimately. He knew the gaps, the blind spots, the precise angles of attack that gave German fighters their best chance of survival. What he did not know, what no Luftwaffe pilot truly understood in March of 1944, was that the Americans had fundamentally changed the nature of aerial combat without firing a single additional round. They had loaded their guns with bullets designed not just to penetrate aluminum skin and shatter engines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But to ignite aviation fuel from distances that German doctrine considered safe, and in that invisible chemical transformation, in the marriage of incendiary compounds with armor-piercing projectiles, lay a revolution in aerial warfare that would help break the Luftwaffe's back. Stigler initiated his attack from 12 o'clock high, diving through the bomber formation with his wingman close behind. Standard doctrine called for head-on passes, exploiting the bomber's relatively weak forward defensive armament while minimizing exposure to the devastating fields of fire from their tail and waist positions. He opened fire at 600 yards, his MG-151 20mm cannon spitting shells at the lead bomber. The American aircraft shuddered as shells impacted the wing root and fuselage. Stigler expected to see the bomber falter, perhaps drop out of formation. Instead, something impossible happened. At 900 yards, well beyond the range where machine gun fire should have any meaningful effect, his Messerschmitt's left-wing fuel tank exploded. Not caught fire, not leaked, exploded. The blast tore through the aluminum structure, shredding control surfaces and igniting the wing's internal framework. Stigler had less than 3 seconds to process what had happened before his fighter became unflyable. He rolled inverted and pulled the canopy jettison handle, then kicked himself free of the disintegrating aircraft. As his parachute deployed and he swung beneath the silk canopy, watching his Messerschmitt spiral down in flames, Franz Stigler became one of the first Luftwaffe pilots to truly understand what American .50 caliber M8 armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could do. The question that would haunt German fighter tactics for the remainder of the war had just been answered with brutal finality. It was how far away do we need to stay to survive them? The Browning M250 caliber machine gun entered United States military service in 1933. Designed by John Moses Browning, the weapon fired a cartridge measuring 5.45 inches in overall length, with a half-inch diameter bullet weighing approximately 700 grains, roughly 1.6 ounces. The kinetic energy delivered at the muzzle exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds, enough to penetrate light armor, destroy engine blocks, and shred aircraft structure. But kinetic energy alone, while devastating, had limitations. A bullet could punch through aluminum skin, hydraulic lines, control cables. It could wound or kill aircrew, yet hitting critical components in a fast-moving fighter required either extraordinary marksmanship or overwhelming volume of fire. German fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf FW-190, were remarkably resistant to structural damage from standard ball. Ammunition. The Americans needed something more lethal. They needed bullets that didn't just damage what they hit. They needed bullets that destroyed everything near what they hit. The solution came from metallurgical chemistry and explosive ordnance engineering. In 1942, Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, developed the M8 armor-piercing incendiary cartridge, designated API in military nomenclature. The projectile's construction was deceptively simple, but represented years of ballistic research. The outer shell was hardened steel, heat-treated to penetrate armor plate. Beneath the steel jacket lay a core of incendiary compound, a carefully formulated mixture that would ignite upon impact with any reasonably hard surface, generating temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Behind the incendiary core sat the actual armor-piercing penetrator, a dense tungsten carbide slug designed to punch through hardened steel. The entire assembly weighed the same as standard ball ammunition, ensuring identical ballistic performance. A gunner didn't need to adjust his sights or change his point of aim when loading API rounds. They flew the same trajectory, struck the same point, but delivered catastrophically different results. The M8 API round was specifically engineered to solve a problem that had plagued aerial combat since the beginning of the war. Aircraft fuel tanks, even when hit repeatedly, often did not ignite. Aviation gasoline required specific conditions to combust, a mixture of fuel, vapor, and oxygen, an ignition source hot enough to exceed the fuel's flash point, and sufficient time for the reaction to propagate. Standard ball ammunition created sparks, certainly, but sparks that lasted mere microseconds, insufficient to reliably ignite fuel unless conditions were perfect. The M8's incendiary core burned for several seconds after impact, essentially functioning as a magnesium flare embedded inside the target. Those seconds were enough to ignite fuel vapor, to heat metal structures past their ignition temperature, to transform a simple bullet hole into a catastrophic fire. German intelligence officers analyzing recovered American ammunition initially dismissed the M8 as a minor incremental improvement. Technical assessment reports from February 1943 noted the incendiary properties, but concluded the effective range remained unchanged from standard ammunition, approximately 400 to 500 yards for reliable hits on fighter-sized targets. They were catastrophically wrong. What German analysts failed to understand was that the M8 didn't need to hit the fighter directly to be lethal. It needed to hit anywhere near the fighter's fuel tanks. And American bombers carried 8 to 1350 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. That volume of fire, combined with the M8's incendiary properties, created a lethal zone around every bomber that extended far beyond what German tactical doctrine considered dangerous. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, Germany's primary fighter in 1944, carried 140 litres of fuel in wing tanks and fuselage tanks directly behind the pilot. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A8 carried 524 litres distributed among multiple tanks, including wing root tanks positioned directly in the path of beam attacks against bomber formations. These fuel systems were designed with some protection. Self-sealing fuel cells with multiple layers of rubber compound that would swell when exposed to gasoline, closing bullet holes within seconds. Armor plating around critical fuel lines. Inert gas systems that filled empty tank volume with carbon dioxide to prevent vapor ignition. But these protections were designed to counter standard ammunition. They were not designed to counter sustained incendiary exposure. When an M8 API round penetrated a German fighter's fuel tank, even if the self-sealing mechanism worked perfectly, the incendiary core continued burning inside the sealed cell. The rubber compound designed to contain fuel now trapped a 3,000-degree heat source inside an enclosed space filled with gasoline vapor. The tank didn't leak fuel that dripped away safely. It became a pressure vessel filled with combusting gas. Seconds later, it exploded. Luftwaffe loss reports from March through August 1944 reveal a dramatic pattern. Fighter aircraft returning from bomber intercept missions with fuel system damage showed a catastrophic increase in losses from post-combat fires. Pilots reported making seemingly successful emergency landings only to have their aircraft erupt in flames moments after touching down, after the combat stress had ended, after they believed they had survived. Ground crews reported finding fighters with sealed fuel tank punctures that showed no external fuel leakage, yet internal examination revealed completely burned-out tank structures. The self-sealing technology designed to save aircraft was paradoxically ensuring their destruction when combined with American incendiary ammunition. It trapped the fire inside rather than letting it vent away harmlessly. Major Günther Rahl, third highest scoring fighter ace in history with 275 confirmed victories, described his first encounter with API ammunition in a 1978 interview. "I attacked a B-17 formation from the rear quarter, standard procedure. My cannon fire struck the left waist position, suppressing that gunner. I closed to 400 meters, good range for my machine guns. Then, my wingman exploded. Just exploded. No warning, no smoke trail, no fire visible from his aircraft before detonation. One moment he was there, the next moment he was falling debris. I broke off immediately, rolled away from the formation. As I came around, I saw my own wing trailing smoke, a line of holes stitched across the fuel tank area. I was already dead. I simply hadn't burned yet. I dove away, heading for our own lines, praying the fire would wait until I could bail out. The fire did wait. I made it down, but my wingman, Lieutenant Becker, 20 years old, 2 victories, he made it exactly nowhere. The Americans had shot him from over 800 meters. I measured it later, working backward from our attack geometry. 800 meters with machine guns. They might as well have hit him with anti-aircraft artillery. The psychological impact of these long-range fuel tank detonations cannot be overstated. German fighter pilots had operated under tactical assumptions developed over 3 years of combat. Attack from beyond 500 meters, and you were wasting ammunition. Close to 300 meters for maximum effectiveness. Accept that the bombers would hit you with defensive fire, but trust your armor, your speed, and your skill to survive the engagement. Those assumptions died with every pilot who exploded at ranges where they believed themselves safe. Fighter groups began reporting reluctance to press attacks. Experienced pilots broke off engagements earlier, limiting their exposure to defensive fire. Less experienced pilots simply refused to close to effective range, firing token bursts from extreme distances before fleeing. Unit cohesion deteriorated as individual survival instinct overwhelmed tactical discipline. The Americans had achieved something extraordinary. They had weaponized fear itself. The effective range question deserves careful examination because it reveals the gap between theoretical capability and practical effectiveness. A 50 caliber M8 API round retained lethal energy out to approximately 1,800 yards under ideal conditions. But hitting a maneuvering fighter at 1,800 yards required luck far more than skill. The bullet flight time at that range exceeded 3 seconds, during which the target aircraft could travel 900 feet in unpredictable directions. At 1,000 yards, the practical limit for aimed fire from a bomber, bullet flight time dropped to approximately 1.5 seconds. A fighter moving at 300 miles per hour covered 660 feet in that time. But bomber formations didn't aim. They created intersecting fields of fire, zone defenses, where dozens of guns fired continuous streams of tracers through specific volumes of airspace. A fighter attacking through those zones had to fly through thousands of rounds, any one of which could penetrate a fuel tank. And unlike kinetic ammunition, where a single penetration might be survivable, a single M8 API hit could be catastrophic. German tactical doctrine evolved in response but never found an adequate solution. High-speed slashing attacks minimized exposure time but reduced firing accuracy. Standoff rocket attacks using 21-centimeter Werfer granate rockets allowed fighters to engage from beyond defensive gun range, but proved wildly inaccurate and depleted limited rocket stocks quickly. Head-on attacks remained most effective, but required flying directly into the combined fire of every forward-facing gun in the formation. Some groups experimented with heavy armor modifications, adding additional plating around fuel tanks and cockpit areas. The weight penalty degraded performance severely, and the armor proved insufficient against concentrated 50 caliber fire anyway. The Messerschmitt Me 63 rocket-powered interceptor was developed partly to exploit a speed advantage that would minimize exposure to defensive fire. By March 1944, however, production delays and fuel shortages meant too few were available too late to matter. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable within existing technological constraints. American bombers carried too many guns loaded with ammunition too effective from ranges too great for German fighters to safely engage. The numerical advantage shifted dramatically in America's favor through 1944. In January, The 8th Air Force, based in England, could dispatch approximately 600 heavy bombers on maximum effort missions. By June, that number exceeded 2,000. Each bomber carried between 8 and 13 50 caliber machine guns. A formation of 2,000 B-17 seconds represented over 20,000 machine guns, each loaded with a mixture of ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. M8 API typically comprised 20 to 30% of the ammunition load, meaning approximately 60,000 API rounds in the air during any given defensive engagement. The Luftwaffe could scramble perhaps 300 to 400 fighters to intercept these formations. Those fighters, each carrying limited ammunition for perhaps 15 seconds of continuous fire, faced defensive firepower that outweighed their offensive capability by orders of magnitude. German pilots understood these odds intimately. They understood that every attack run held a high probability of death, not from superior American skill, but from simple mathematics. Thousands of bullets filling the sky, each one potentially lethal from ranges where they couldn't even see the bomber clearly. The attrition rate among Luftwaffe fighter pilots reached unsustainable levels by summer 1944. In June alone, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 450 single-engine fighters over the Reich, roughly half the entire fighter force committed to home defense. Replacement aircraft arrived faster than replacement pilots. Training programs accelerated, cutting flight hours and combat preparation time to meet desperate demand for warm bodies in cockpits. These inexperienced pilots died even faster than the veterans they replaced. An average Luftwaffe fighter pilot in June 1944 could expect to survive approximately 4 to 6 combat missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. This compared to 20 to 30 missions for pilots in early 1943 before M8 API ammunition became standard in American bomber formations. The cause and effect relationship was clear in Luftwaffe after-action reports and loss analysis documents. More fighters were burning in flight rather than making forced landings. More pilots were bailing out of apparently undamaged aircraft that then exploded seconds later. More aircraft were total losses from post-landing fires despite successful emergency landings. The M8 API round had transformed the defensive envelope around American bombers from a zone of danger into a zone of death. Technical countermeasures proved inadequate or impractical. Enhanced self-sealing fuel tank designs using thicker rubber compounds worked in laboratory testing, but failed under combat conditions, where multiple penetrations overwhelmed the sealing mechanism. External armor plating added weight that degraded performance unacceptably. The Luftwaffe's fuel supply situation by mid-1944 made matters worse, as shortages forced the use of lower-quality synthetic fuel that was actually more volatile than standard aviation gasoline, increasing fire risk. Some experimental approaches showed promise, but never reached operational deployment. The Messerschmitt Me 262 night fighter variant tested a pressurized fuel system that used compressed air to prevent vapor formation in tanks, eliminating the combustion risk. Weight and complexity prevented adoption. Focke-Wulf experimented with foam-filled fuel tanks where cells were filled with reticulated foam that prevented fuel from sloshing and reduced vapor space. Production capacity couldn't meet demand. The reality was harsh and simple. German fighters in mid-1944 were defending the Reich with aircraft designed in 1938 and 1939, carrying fuel in tanks designed to survive kinetic damage, fighting an enemy who had evolved beyond kinetic damage as a primary killing mechanism. They were bringing sword techniques to a gunfight, and they were dying because of it. General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, understood the crisis with painful clarity. His post-war memoir, published in 1954, included extensive analysis of the fuel tank vulnerability problem. We knew the Americans were using incendiary ammunition. We knew our tanks were being ignited. What we did not understand until too late was how far outside effective range this made their defensive fire. A pilot attacking from 1,000 meters believed himself beyond serious danger. Historical combat showed machine gun fire at that range was essentially harassing fire, psychologically disruptive but not tactically significant. But with API ammunition, 1,000 meters was well within lethal range. Not because they could aim accurately at that distance, but because they filled so much sky with bullets that accuracy became irrelevant. We calculated that a B-17 formation of 36 aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Flying Standard Combat Box Formation created a defensive zone approximately 800 meters deep, where any attacking fighter had better than 50% probability of being hit by at least one .50 caliber round. With API ammunition, that single hit could be fatal. We had no counter to this, no tactical approach that allowed us to attack effectively while avoiding this zone. We could stand off and fire rockets, wasting expensive ammunition for minimal effect. We could make high-speed slashing passes that gave us perhaps 2 seconds of firing time before we had to break away. Or we could close to effective range and accept that 1 in every 2 or 3 pilots would not return. These were not acceptable tactical choices. They were choices between different methods of losing. The human cost manifested in ways beyond simple casualty statistics. Luftwaffe fighter pilot morale, which had remained relatively high through 1943 despite worsening odds, collapsed through 1944. Units reported increased instances of pilots claiming mechanical problems to avoid combat missions. Others developed what modern psychiatry would recognize as combat stress reaction, refusing to fly or suffering psychosomatic symptoms that grounded them. The German military medical system, less sophisticated and less forgiving than its American counterpart, offered little support for pilots suffering psychological breakdown. Many simply stopped flying and faced court-martial for cowardice. Some were executed. Others were reassigned to penal battalions on the Eastern Front. The message was clear: fly and face near-certain death, or refuse and face guaranteed death. There was no third option. Franz Stigler, the pilot who opened this account, survived his bailout over the Ruhr Valley in March 1944. He made it to the ground with minor injuries, evaded capture for 3 days, and eventually returned to his unit. He flew 21 more combat missions before the war ended, scoring 3 additional victories. In a 1987 interview conducted as part of an oral history project, Stigler was asked what technological advancement he believed most impacted the air war over Germany. His answer was immediate and unequivocal: the American API rounds. Not the P-51 Mustang, though that was devastating. Not the Norden bomb sight, though that enabled precision strikes. Not even radar or proximity fuses. The incendiary bullets. They killed more of us than anything else because they didn't require the Americans to be better pilots or better shots. They just required them to hit us once, anywhere near our fuel tanks. And they hit us constantly because they had so many guns and so much ammunition. I watched friends burn at ranges where they thought they were safe. I watched skilled pilots die on their first mission because an API round found their wing tank from 800 meters. In 1942, a fighter pilot with good instincts and strong nerves could survive 30, 40, 50 missions. By mid-1944, with API ammunition standard in bomber loads, surviving 10 missions made you a veteran. The mathematics had changed. The odds had changed. We adapted our tactics, but we couldn't adapt fast enough or well enough to survive what they'd done to us. The production statistics for M8 API ammunition reveal the scale of American industrial mobilization. In 1942, Frankfurt Arsenal produced approximately 50 million .50 caliber rounds total, with API variants comprising less than 5% of output. By 1944, total production exceeded 1.2 billion rounds annually, with M8 API representing 35% of ammunition shipped to European theatre. That's 420 million armor-piercing incendiary rounds per year flowing into bomber ammunition bays, approximately 1.15 million rounds per day, 48,000 rounds per hour. The American industrial machine had weaponized chemistry and deployed it in volumes that no enemy could withstand through skill alone. The tactical evolution of American bomber defensive doctrine reflected growing confidence in their ammunition's effectiveness. Early 1943 formations flew tight defensive boxes that sacrificed bombing accuracy for maximum overlapping fields of fire. By late 1944, formations loosened significantly, allowing better bomb patterns while still maintaining adequate defensive capability. The difference was the ammunition. Gunners no longer needed to concentrate fire to achieve kills. A distributed formation with good spacing meant attacking fighters faced defensive fire from more angles, reducing blind spots, while individual gunners could engage targets at ranges that would have been pointless with standard ball ammunition. The Germans noticed this change and understood what it implied. American confidence in their defensive ammunition was so high they were willing to sacrifice formation cohesion for bombing effectiveness. Technical analysis of recovered ammunition from American bombers shot down over Germany provided disturbing confirmation of M8 API's effectiveness. Luftwaffe ordnance specialists conducted controlled tests, firing captured API rounds at fuel tanks removed from damaged German fighters. The results were unambiguous. Standard ball ammunition created clean penetrations that self-sealing fuel cells handled adequately. M8 API rounds created penetrations that ignited tank contents even when self-sealing mechanisms functioned perfectly. The incendiary core continued burning inside the sealed tank, raising internal pressure until explosive failure occurred. Against full tanks, ignition time averaged 2.3 seconds. Against partially empty tanks with maximum vapor space, ignition time averaged 1.4 seconds. In every single test firing, the target tank either caught fire or exploded. The test report, dated August 15, 1944, concluded with stark language rarely seen in German technical documents: countermeasures. None identified within current technological capacity. Recommendation: develop fighter aircraft with fuel tank arrangements that place all fuel storage outside projectile paths from bomber defensive positions. Alternate recommendation: develop engagement tactics that avoid bomber defensive fire entirely. The first recommendation was impossible. You cannot design a fighter where fuel tanks are not in the path of potential enemy fire. The second recommendation was equally impossible. You cannot intercept bombers without entering range of their defensive weapons. The Luftwaffe had been presented with an unsolvable problem, and they knew it. By December 1944, the air war over Germany had effectively ended as a contest. The Luftwaffe still flew, still fought, still occasionally scored victories. The attrition equation had become mathematically insurmountable. American bomber formations could absorb losses of 10 to 15% and continue operations indefinitely because replacement aircraft and crews arrived faster than losses accumulated. The Luftwaffe was losing 40 to 50% of committed fighters in major engagements, a rate that consumed entire fighter groups in weeks. The M8 API round hadn't single-handedly won the air war. No single weapon ever does. But it had fundamentally altered the tactical calculus in America's favor by extending the lethal range of bomber defensive fire beyond the point where German fighters could safely engage. Combined with increasing American fighter escort coverage, overwhelming numerical superiority, and collapsing German logistics, the effect was decisive. The Luftwaffe died above the cities it was sworn to defend, one burning fighter at a time. Franz Stigler survived the war. He emigrated to Canada in 1953, became a successful businessman, and lived until 2008. In his final years, he participated in several historical conferences about the air war over Europe, sharing his experiences with historians and veterans from both sides. At a 2004 symposium in Munich, he sat on a panel with retired American bomber gunners. The conversation turned to ammunition effectiveness. One gunner mentioned loading belts with 30% API rounds. Stigler nodded slowly, then spoke. 30%. That was enough to kill 30% of us, maybe more. We knew about your API ammunition, but knowing and experiencing are different things. When you watch your wingman explode at 800 meters, when you feel your own wing tank ignite while you're still too far away to even see the gunner who shot you, knowledge becomes terror. We were terrified by those bullets. Not the way you're frightened in combat, that passes. Sustained terror, the kind that makes you question whether you can force yourself into the cockpit tomorrow. because we knew the mathematics. Enough bullets in the sky, enough of them loaded with incendiary compound, and it didn't matter how skilled we were or how good our aircraft were. Eventually, one would find our fuel tank, and then we would burn. The symposium audience, mostly historians and aging veterans, sat in silence as Stigler finished speaking. Then one of the American gunners, a former staff sergeant who had flown 35 missions in B-17 seconds, stood and extended his hand. Stigler shook it, and the two old men, enemies once, comrades now in the brotherhood of those who survived, stood together while the audience applauded. The legacy of the M8 API round extends beyond World War II. Modern aircraft ammunition still uses armor-piercing incendiary designs, based on principles developed at Frankfurt Arsenal in 1942. The specific chemical formulations have evolved, materials science has advanced, but the fundamental concept remains unchanged. A bullet that doesn't just penetrate but ignites is vastly more lethal than a bullet that only penetrates. Fighter aircraft fuel systems today use advanced fire suppression technologies, foam-filled tanks, inert gas generation systems, armored fuel lines, and damage-resistant materials specifically designed to survive API hits. These technologies exist because the M8 proved how vulnerable fuel systems were to incendiary attack. The lesson learned over Germany in 1944 shaped 60 years of aviation fuel system design. The American bomber crews who flew through German flak and fighters never fully understood how their ammunition changed the war. They loaded their guns with whatever rounds the armorer provided, fired at attacking fighters, and hoped to survive. Most never knew that roughly 1 in 3 bullets they fired was specifically designed to ignite enemy fuel tanks from ranges, enemies considered safe. They simply did their jobs, fought their fights, and went home when the war ended. But the German pilots knew, every Luftwaffe fighter pilot who survived 1944 knew exactly what M8 API ammunition could do because they watched it burn their comrades from ranges that should have been safe, at distances where they believed defensive fire was merely harassing rather than lethal. They learned through brutal experience that American engineering had given bomber gunners the ability to kill not through superior skill, but through superior chemistry. And in learning that lesson, in adapting their tactics to counter a threat they ultimately couldn't counter, they lost the air war over Germany. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because their fuel tanks contained gasoline and American bullets contained fire, and those two substances, when combined at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, created explosions that no amount of training or determination could survive. The air war over Europe was decided by many factors: strategic decisions, industrial capacity, tactical innovations, technological breakthroughs, the courage of men on both sides. But among those factors, the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round deserves recognition as one of the most quietly decisive weapons of the conflict. It didn't make headlines. It didn't end the war overnight. It simply made German fighters burn at ranges where they thought they were safe. And in doing so, it helped ensure that American bombers completed their missions, American gunners survived to see their families again, and the Allied air campaign achieved the air superiority necessary for victory. Today, fragments of M8 API ammunition can still be found in fields across Germany where fighters fell in 1944. Small steel jackets corroded by 75 years of weather, incendiary cores long since depleted, inert relics of a weapon that once terrified the most skilled fighter pilots in the world. Collectors occasionally find them, display them at militaria shows, sell them to museums. They look unremarkable, small, corroded, anonymous among thousands of similar relics. But in March 1944, over the Ruhr Valley, one of those small, unremarkable bullets found Franz Stigler's wing tank from 900 yards away and taught the Luftwaffe a lesson they could never unlearn. Sometimes the most important weapons don't look impressive. Sometimes victory comes not from building better fighters or training better pilots, but from loading better bullets. The Americans understood this. They built bullets that set fire to everything they touched, and with those bullets, they burned the Luftwaffe out of the sky. The statistical analysis reveals the truth in numbers that human memory cannot capture. Between January and December 1944, the 8th Air Force fired approximately 780 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in defensive engagements over Europe. Of those, roughly 270 million were M8 API rounds. German loss reports attribute approximately 42% of single-engine fighter losses during this period to defensive fire from bomber formations, as opposed to escort fighter attacks or anti-aircraft artillery. This represents approximately 1,800 fighters destroyed by bomber gunners, with an additional 3,000 damaged severely enough to require extensive repair or be written off as total losses. The correlation between API ammunition deployment and increased defensive effectiveness is statistically undeniable. In the first quarter of 1943, before M8 API became standard, bomber defensive gunners achieved approximately 1 confirmed kill per 32 fighters engaged. By the second quarter of 1944, with API comprising 30 to 35% of ammunition loads, gunners achieved approximately 1 confirmed kill per 8 fighters engaged. The lethality increased by 400% while American gunnery training remained largely unchanged. The difference was the ammunition. The psychological dimension extended beyond individual pilot fear into institutional doctrine. Luftwaffe tactical manuals revised in September 1944 included explicit warnings about American incendiary ammunition and recommended engagement ranges be increased to 1,000 meters or greater. But these recommendations created an impossible tactical contradiction. German fighter armament, optimized for close-range combat, lost effectiveness dramatically beyond 600 meters. The MG-151 20mm cannon, the Luftwaffe's primary air-to-air weapon, had a practical, effective range of approximately 400 meters against maneuvering targets. Engaging bombers from 1,000 meters meant firing at ranges where German weapons were marginally effective, while still remaining within range where American defensive fire was highly lethal. The doctrine revision essentially instructed pilots to attack from ranges where they couldn't hurt the enemy, but the enemy could still hurt them. Experienced pilots recognized this as institutional surrender disguised as tactical guidance. The document was telling them to die slowly rather than quickly, but it was still telling them to die. Major Heinrich Oehler, commander of Jagdgeschwader 5, was court-martialed in February 1945 for failing to intercept an Allied bomber formation. During his trial, he delivered a statement that encapsulated the impossible position Luftwaffe fighter pilots faced. "You order us to intercept American bombers. You provide us aircraft with fuel for 90 minutes of flight. You give us ammunition sufficient for 15 seconds of fire. You tell us to engage from 1,000 meters where our weapons are ineffective. You tell us the enemy's weapons remain effective to 1,000 meters and beyond. You tell us one hit from their incendiary ammunition will likely destroy our aircraft. Then, you court-martial us for failing to press home attacks that your own tactical doctrine acknowledges are suicidal." I did not fail to intercept. I failed to commit suicide on schedule. Oehler was found guilty and executed by firing squad. His statement was recorded in the trial transcript and later became one of the most frequently cited documents in post-war analysis of Luftwaffe collapse. It captured the brutal reality that German fighter pilots faced in the final year of the war, sent to fight battles they could not win with tactics that ensured their deaths, punished for the crime of surviving when doctrine demanded they die attacking. The human beings who loaded those M8 API rounds into bomber gun belts rarely thought about what they were doing beyond the immediate technical task. Armourers worked through English winters and scorching summer days, loading ammunition belts, maintaining guns, ensuring every aircraft left the hardstand with full loads. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York, mechanics from California. They did their jobs with the same casual competence Americans brought to every logistical task, never quite grasping that they were loading weapons that would rewrite the tactical equation of aerial combat. One armourer, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell from Birmingham, Alabama, kept a diary throughout his service with the 391st Bomb Group. His entry from July 8, 1944, reads simply, "Loaded 86 aircraft today, hot as hell, Mess served chicken that tasted like cardboard. New API ammunition came in, supposed to be better for setting fires. Sure, hope the boys don't need it, but glad they have it if they do. Mitchell's matter-of-fact tone, his focus on routine discomfort rather than historical significance, represents the American approach to warfare. Build better weapons, deploy them efficiently, trust the men using them to do their jobs. No drama, no philosophy, just competent execution of necessary tasks. That practical competence, multiplied across thousands of air bases and millions of personnel, created the industrial and logistical superiority that overwhelmed German technological sophistication. The Luftwaffe built elegant fighters flown by skilled pilots. America built adequate fighters in overwhelming numbers, gave them ammunition that didn't require skill to be lethal, and deployed them with logistical efficiency that ensured they never ran out. In that contrast lay the outcome of the war itself, not just in the air but on every front. Superior engineering solving tactical problems through material abundance rather than individual excellence. The M8 API round embodied this philosophy perfectly. It made average gunners lethal. It extended effective range beyond what skill alone could achieve. It ensured that volume of fire compensated for imperfect aim, and most importantly, it worked. German fighters burned, American bombers came home. The missions continued. The war was won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.